So this is the book that ended my binge eating. There are so many other books, but why this book? The one that I recommend if you're starting your binge eating recovery journey or if you're in the middle of your binge eating recovery journey. So I want to welcome you to the first episode of the series called Book Club, where I'll be reviewing books on binge eating, body image, emotional eating, all those stuff around that area. So if you have any suggestions for me to review and certain books, if they're legit or not, then comment below and let's get started with Overcoming Binge Eating by Dr. Christopher Fairburn. So Overcoming Binge Eating is a really good book because it's a guided self-help book, and a guided self-help book essentially means that you do the treatment yourself, you do the CBT yourself. You don't need to have a therapist or a counselor or another professional to have a one-to-one chat with. Half of the book essentially is education on what is binge eating, what are subjective, objective binges, what triggers binge eating, all those kinds of stuff. And the other half is what's called CBTE, which is Enhanced Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. So I'm going to talk about what is included in the first half and what's included in the second half of the education bit, the CBTE, and how to implement CBTE. So one of the first questions the book talks about is, what is binge eating? Because we often think like binge eating is just a couple of cookies. Is it actually a couple of cookies? Or is it actually 10 cookies? Or is it 20 cookies? So if you look to the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, we can see the proper definition of what a binge eating episode is. So we can see that binge eating episodes are characterized by eating on autopilot essentially, and feeling guilt right after eating, embarrassment, shame, and just eating so quickly in almost like in a rapid mood, like you feel like it's a life or death situation when you're binge eating, and then after that you just can't remember what's happened, like, oh, what did I just eat? You almost feel like you're in a trance really during a binge eating episode. So in the book, Dr. Christopher Fairburn talks about the two types of binges, objective and subjective binges. It's important to know what type of binge, or try your best to recognize what type of binge you're having. Is it objective or subjective? So objective binges, where you feel like you've eaten 5,000 calories and you've actually eaten 5,000 calories if someone else was to look at it, or another professional or a friend. But a subjective binge is what you think, what you perceive. So you might consider yourself having a binge eating episode, but in reality it was just 3 cookies, which is not even as much as most people would do in an objective binge. So it's important to recognize, do you have this kind of portion distortion or this distorted image around what a binge eating episode is? There a certain amount of calories you think would be considered as binge? Or do you think you're actually having a binge when other people might not consider it a binge? Or are you actually having a binge and other people see it as a binge as well? So in the book it progresses to talk about a binge restrict cycle. So what is the binge restrict cycle? So it talks about, you have a binge eating episode, you feel guilty, you have low self-esteem, you jump onto a restrictive diet, and then that triggers another binge eating episode, and then you feel guilty, low self-esteem, and then you restrict in an attempt to make up for this binge. So in this binge restrict cycle, you're in this never-ending cycle of forever trying to make up for the last binge, trying to undereat calories the next day if you binged last night, which is triggering a binge eating episode because your body's thinking there's a famine going on. It's going to ramp up the intense need to have psychological and physical craving for food. So recognizing that you're in the binge restrict cycle and there is a way to escape the cycle is really, really helpful for escaping binge eating episodes, or this never-ending cycle of binging, restricting. And then moving on to the other half of the book, it talks about CBTE, which is specific to eating disorders. So the second half of the book talks about the evidence that CBTE is actually very helpful in reducing disordered eating habits and eating disorders. So whether you have binge eating disorder, which is the full-on diagnosed eating disorder, or binge eating, you might be having the episodes, which is just the habit. But once it's diagnosed by a proper health professional or a doctor, then that's when it becomes binge eating disorder, with most people saying that intuitive eating is the farthest thing away from eating disorders. And then you have like disordered eating, and then eating disorder, which is the full-blown other end of the spectrum. So in the book it talks about CBTE, and the difference between CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, and CBTE is specific to binge eating disorder and bulimia. So it's specific just to get rid of those eating habits, those disordered eating thoughts, and try to go back and recognize those patterns. What are those patterns that are leading to binge eating habits? Because remember, we talked about earlier about the binge restrict cycle. Binge, feel guilty, low self-esteem, and then restrict. But sometimes if we're in the binge restrict cycle for so long, you might not even recognize it. You might be just hitting yourself in the head thinking that, oh, it's all my fault, I have no willpower, I have no discipline. When in reality, CBT is mainly focused on recognizing those patterns. What are those patterns that are leading me to have binge eating episodes? It makes you more curious. And CBTE consists of like lots of journaling and monitoring your intake and how you feel. So in the book, when you're going to be starting CBTE, you're going to be trying to fill 2 record sheets. So one is going to be a daily record sheet where you write in, I had this for breakfast, I don't think I consider that a binge, or I consider that the binge. So in the book, Dr. Christopher Fairburn says that you have to finish 2 kinds of record sheets. One is a daily record sheet where you'll be writing the time of the day, the meal or snack or drink that you had, and then would you consider that a binge? And how did you feel? Did you feel happy? Did you feel embarrassed? Did you feel shameful? And what place did this take part in? Was it in the office? Was there a certain celebration? Did you feel that you're really hungry? Were you really full that time? So you're just trying to trigger more of mindful eating. So what's happening here, although it might seem a bit tedious, monitoring is extremely important for CBT and CBTE. And in this book, when you're engaging in monitoring how you feel, do you consider it a binge, and what time, and what your emotions are, then it actually triggers the frontal lobe of your brain. And you might be thinking, oh, here we go again, more journaling, can't I have any more tips that doesn't involve me doing any work? And in reality, journaling is extremely important, not just like a Dear Diary kind of thing, but how you feel and what time you had that meal, and then where, and how did it make you feel afterwards, and if you consider it a binge, because this is triggering mindful eating. And the more mindful you are of eating, you're not just simply being aware, but it's actually changing your brain neurologically. So if you want to learn more about that, you can check this video here, which I'm going to be linking in this video, on how I broke my binge eating habits like a monk. Because long story short, if you're engaging in like unconscious habits, that's using the basal ganglia part of your brain, which is the unconscious habits, which is run by dopamine. But if you engage in mindful eating, then you're triggering, or you're using more of your frontal lobe, which is the command center of your brain, and you're aware, and you can break these habits or these binge eating urges. So long story short, in paper 1, you'll be needing to fill monitoring sheets, how you feel for breakfast, lunch and dinner, and snacks in between. And then next, you'll be having to complete weekly monitoring sheets. So these weekly review sessions will be consisting of how many days in the week did you take part in monitoring in the day. So maybe did you monitor your intake like 4 times out of 7 days in the week, or did you monitor it 7 out of 7 times? And then you're going to be taking part in monitoring your weight, because it's not going to go crazy high, and at the same time it's not going to go crazy low recovery. You're, rather than eating like tons of food in the evening and then almost nothing in the morning or the afternoon, you're only like splitting this all up, so your brain's not triggering the intense urge to binge eat. So you're having like a comfortable breakfast, mid-morning snack, lunch, mid-afternoon snack, and dinner, and maybe an evening snack, and you're staying at around like a 7 or at a 10 full. So essentially you're reducing the triggers, which would put you vulnerable to a binge eating episode. So in the book it talks about DBT, which is dialectical behavioral therapy skills, which is different from CBT. So DBT is more on acceptance and mindfulness and breaking binge eating urges. So one DBT skill that the book really pushes is urge surfing. So urge surfing is a skill that's really helpful before you have a binge, when you have the urge, because sometimes when you have the urge to binge, you often feel like, okay, I'm going to prepare for the binge, I'm going to bring all the food out and put it in front of the table or bring it to my room. So sometimes when you have the urge to binge, you take out all the food from your cupboards or the fridge and you bring it to your room or bring it to the table, or you start ordering from your takeaway app because you thought, okay, I had the urge, even if it's a tiny little urge, I'm going to start ordering everything and preparing for the binge, because there's no point like fighting against it. Well, urge surfing goes by the idea that urges come and then they go. So they rise up for like 30 minutes and then they start to disappear or try to fade away. So what we need to do in urge surfing is to essentially distract ourselves in a nice, relaxing, self-care based activity. So it could be listening to a nice podcast, maybe reading a book, maybe having a shower, maybe just watching a nice YouTube video. So the goal of urge surfing is to disconnect yourself from urge equals action. So it might be really difficult at first when you have the urge that you should take part in a self-care activity. But the more you do this, you're increasing the gap between urge and action, and you're not a slave to the urge and action. So the gap is really there. So the more you practice it, you have a bigger and bigger and bigger gap, and it'll be easier for you to break these binge eating urges and escape the trance, essentially. So in summary, there are some pros and cons to the book. So I'd say the pros is essentially it's a guided self-help book. So if you're financially having a hard time finding a therapist or getting into waiting lists to see a therapist or a dietitian or a doctor, then since it's a guided self-help book, which is recommended by, at least in the UK, which I know is first line for binge eating disorder, is guided self-help books. So this is a guided self-help book. So if you can't like find an appointment and you want to like end binge eating, so this is a really good place, because it starts with education, the first half of the book, and then the second half of the book is action, where you can try to end binge eating yourself. So another pro of the book, which is really, really helpful, is that it teaches you to engage in journaling, mindfulness, and trying to be mindful of your own situations. Because sometimes, sure, we can have like a therapist who could like teach us, or a counselor or a psychiatrist or a dietitian to help us and guide us with recognizing our own thoughts and dietary dietary habits, but if we do it ourselves from our own volition, then we're much more likely to break these urges. So, and the reason for this is because you're doing it from your own motivation rather than someone else guiding you to pluck out the motivation for you. So for the cons of the book, there are two things. So the first thing is that it doesn't really go through emotional eating, invalidation, childhood, trauma, and how these could like contribute to binge eating later in life. Like for example, when you're eating a meal when you're maybe much younger, then your parents might have said, or your loved ones might have said like, oh, you can't have dessert unless you finish all of your meals, which is some form of gatekeeping, which can like carry on much later in life. So it doesn't talk very much on like childhood and trauma and invalidation. And this is extremely important, personally, I feel like, in binge eating disorder recovery, because recognizing this trauma and where it's coming from and how invalidation could like trigger binge eating episodes later in life is really a big thing. So the second con I have for this book is essentially it talks about binge eating and bulimia. And it's great to have like binge eating disorder and bulimia into one book, but personally I feel like there's so much in this world of binge eating disorder and binge eating habits that it should be a book in itself. And bulimia, which is a heavily psychological eating disorder with like purging and compensatory habits, that it should be in a whole book in itself on separate books on their own, because there's a ton of like psychological things. And when you get these two confused, it's easy to misdiagnose yourself. And since this book essentially is a self-guided help book, you might be thinking, okay, I have bulimia and I'm gonna stick to telling everyone I have bulimia without any diagnostic confirmation from a doctor. So essentially, in my opinion, binge eating disorder and bulimia should be separate books rather than this. But overall, I'd give it a 9 out of 10 because it's an amazing book, and personally it ended my binge eating episodes and helped me recognize these habits. And although that most people think that journaling could be a pain, and sometimes it really can be, it can be quite exhausting, but if you have the mindset that each time we journal, we write something down, a meal down, and how we feel, and if we think it's a binge or not, that's actually changing our brain structure. It's actually like changing these neurological pathways. We're starting to really rewire our brain, literally. So many people dull down mindful eating, but mindful eating is what made like monks, essentially, if you can, I'll link this video again here, how I broke my binge eating habits like a monk. It's essentially how monks have so much self-control. The secret is they don't have self-control. They actually are so mindful of everything they do that they don't have the craving for it. So I hope you found this first episode of Book Club really helpful, and comment below, have you read this book and what are your experiences with it? And remember, always check the link in the description because I have lots of freebies on how to end binge eating, how to reintroduce trigger foods, and I also have my 30-day Conquer Cravings course, 30 days, 30 videos. It's all in the link in the description if you want to learn more about it, and I'll see you in the next video. See ya!